Okay, we'll record to the cloud in that case, and then hopefully we'll find it later. Christine Townsend, Green Party Councillor, and just a tiny bit of background. Jenny, in fact, came across Christine on Not the Andrew Marr show in March and was very impressed, and therefore contacted Christine, who's very kindly now going to take us through her presentation. Go ahead, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me along. Always a pleasure to talk about some of the work that's been happening in Bristol. So I'm a teacher by profession, best part of 25 years, and it was kind of my work around education that brought me to be one of the founding members of what became known as Countering Colston. And on here was the kind of this is the logo that after a while we kind of adopted, and the younger people in the group because they told us that we needed this kind of thing, and they were correct. So that was interesting. So I've called this Myths and Emotional Legends, because there was so much mythology that had been created around this man, Edward Colston, in Bristol, but also that there were emotional ties that were being actively promoted and reinforced, if you like. And hopefully as we go through this kind of PowerPoint, you'll be able to see where those were enforced and where they were kind of instilled, particularly in our children, which is where I came in and got quite upset about. And then also teaching to remember. So what is it that we're kind of encouraged to remember, particularly about this man, but also about what does that say about kind of, you know, who the good people are in our city, who the not so good people are in our city, what the structures are, and then teaching to forget. So what is it that kind of were we surrounded with, if you like? What was the kind of public domain infrastructure and decoration and things like that? So that was kind of what I've came up with. So I think it's really important to say that despite the fact that it was the statue that went in the harbour, Countering Colston, we were never really interested in the statue, particularly at the beginning. Despite the fact that this is what was written on, so this is the plaque. So a lot has been mentioned about the plaque. So the top there in the black, that was the plaque here. If you can see my cursor. So this is the plaque here. So written here when and it's still there today, was that it was erected by the citizens of Bristol because we wanted to memorialise apparently one of our most virtuous and wise sons of our city. So it was erected in 1895, 174 years after the actual individual had died. And I suppose there's a few things to say about that, not least the fact that it wasn't obviously in 1895, a fraction of the population had any kind of democratic influence, locally or nationally. And what the research around Edward Colston discovered, and when they looked particularly at this statue, it wasn't the citizens of Bristol at all, because basically they came to the conclusion that pretty much most of the money was put forward by one person. And so this was something that obviously those that erected this statue wanted us to remember. This is how they wanted us to kind of think about and remember Edward Colston, although you know, in the end he went in the harbour, which was actually quite amusing and a fantastic day actually, even though I wasn't there, because there was a huge pandemic going on. So really important that it was never about the particular statue, particularly when we started. However, Countering Colston as a group, our first piece of action was in 2015. So it was really quite a very short period of time, going from Colston basically being everywhere in the centre of our city, and it almost there had been, you know, over the years there had been criticisms of Edward Colston, but nothing like what happened once Countering Colston was kind of formed, really. And I chose this picture because, having attended the court case, I wasn't there for the entirety, but I was there when the prosecution claimed that it was a small group of people that broke off from the main protest group to surround the statue. And of course, you know, this was the kind of image that was shown to the jury. So, and there's quite a few people there, and that's just sort of one angle. And the police officer, they had a statement from a police officer at the court case that estimated the people that the small group that apparently broke off were about 3,000 people that were surrounding this statue and kind of very, very interested in what was going to happen to this statue on this particular day. So it's quite a short period of time really between our first piece of action and then this statue coming down. So we were very much building on foundations that had been laid over many, many years. And I'll later we'll kind of look at that. But this was kind of what we were up against, if you like. This is what we knew. This is where Colston was kind of celebrated or remembered. So there were schools, no longer in Bristol, 3 of them named that carry the man's surname. There are streets, and there are many streets that still carry the man's surname, although a number of them, as I'm sure you can imagine, have been graffitied on and crossed out and, you know, or renamed Fallen Street, things like this. There was the statue in the centre, the famous one that went in the river, but there was also a couple of miniatures. One was in, because two of these 3 schools that carried the man's name were private schools, and they had miniatures of this statue in their reception areas. And this particular this is supposed to be Edward Colston here, and this is actually his tomb. This is in a church right in the centre of Bristol called All Saints Church, and up behind him you can't see it, but this is all the great things that he did. This is kind of praising the man and saying how wonderful he was. And there was a kind of sort of there's another sort of bust head and sort of top bit of him, another statue. So there's about 4 that we became aware of. There's a number of portraits in these private buildings that are named after him, but the main one really in the public domain was hanging in the Lord Mayor's office in the council houses. And Cleo Lake, who was a Green Party councillor, she became the Lord Mayor, and the first thing she did was take it down and replace it with a kind of modern piece of art. And that portrait that was in the kind of public arena, if you like, was taken down quite quickly by her. So there were buildings named after Colston. So this is in the centre of Bristol. It's no longer called Colston Tower, but this was built in the 70s. This is an office block, and they named it Colston Tower. They probably did. The people that named it Colston Tower probably didn't really know why. It was just like, well, the street up the road is called Colston Street, so we'll call it Colston Tower. So there's objects named after Colston. So this is one down here. This is called a Colston bun. So this is kind of a bit like a lardy cake or a Chelsea bun. So it's very big, and on the top they have something called the starver. So it's kind of it's like so it's like a fruit bun. The little one sits on the top, and then you get the big one on the bottom. And the starver is for the children. So for the children, the idea is that the children would eat that immediately, and then they take the bigger one home to give it to their family. And these girls here are from the private school. Their uniform is one of their private schools. There was a novel that was written in the Victorian period. It was kind of a romance, but it was based on a lot of historical research. It was a kind of historical novels, I think they call it, where there's a bit of, you know, the setting is based on historical truth. And then there's this thing about the hair and nails. Now, we thought for a very long time that this was a complete myth. But the legend or the myth is that in the Victorian period, this church, the church where I go back. The church, the All Saints Church, the family wanted they wanted the body back of Edward Colston, so they kind of opened the tomb, and the legend is that the body was really well preserved, and so there's this myth, this legend that actually some of the nails and the hair from the body were removed, and it was it was kind of knocking around, if you like. Nobody really knew, and then during the course of my research, other people's research, we came across a little piece written by a Year 7 student who went to Colston Girls' School, and they'd been out on a kind of introductory, they called it Heritage Day, and she'd written it up for the newsletter. So she was telling the parents, if you like, the things that Year 7 students did on their Heritage Day. And she actually disclosed that they were taken up to the Society of Merchant Venturers, who were the main defenders of the Colston cult. They took them up to their headquarters, and they were shown what they were told was the hair and nails of Edward Colston. And what I found interesting about that is that actually it doesn't really matter whether it is or whether it wasn't the hair of nails of Edward Colston. The point is that members of the establishment who had who've been, running Bristol's, the city of Bristol for hundreds of years, were telling children that these things existed. And from an educational perspective, that was kind of, the things that kind of really kind of stuck with me, if you like. So there's symbols. So this is the dolphin here, is a Colston. So there's a legend around this, that one of his ships got a hole in it, and a dolphin kind of sort of sacrificed itself, if you like, to block the hole so the ship didn't sink, and Edward Colston didn't lose any of his money. So that symbol is very heavily associated with him. The flower, so I don't think you can see it in this picture, but during some of these when they go to the cathedral, what the children do is they wear what was said to be his favourite flower, which is a kind of gold or a yellow chrysanthemum, which so was his favourite flower. So to kind of mark him as so institutions and organisations, there's schools. There were a number of charities in Bristol. So there was the Colston Society, which was kind of known as the Mother Society, if you like. And then they also had the Dolphin Society. They had the Anchor Society, the Grateful Society. And these were, say, charities that had sort of trusts attached to them, and they would do what they would tell the people of Bristol was really good work, apparently. And then this living history, and this is largely what Countering Colston went after. So the living history were kind of rituals that happened on an annual basis. So November was the month when these ceremonies happened. So Commemoration Day was when students from Colston Girls' School would go down to Bristol Cathedral, and they would have a religious ceremony in the cathedral, and they would talk about Edward Colston. They would read from his will. They sang a hymn that was said to be one of his favourite hymns, and then at the end of that, they would get their Colston bun. The celebrations, that would be largely from the charities. So the people who ran the charities, who were all largely members of the merchant venturers as well, but also those that benefited from the charities, or maybe lived in the almshouses that they'd run, those sorts of things. And then there were also these sort of parades, and I've got an image for you later of what the merchants look like when they go on one of their parades. It's like something out of Downton Abbey, but I got a picture, and you'll be able to see that shortly. And these all happen in the first 2 weeks of November, because Colston was born. He was born either on the 2nd or the 13th, but it's something to do with the change of the calendar. So they had this period of 2 weeks where there were lots of this kind of ritual and celebrations and commemorations that were very much in the present. And it was from the 1920s that actually it was the Reverend H.J. Wilkins. It was the first piece of evidence that we found that he described this as a cult, this kind of ritualistic over memorialization and over celebration of this one particular person. And we started to use that term, the cult of Colston, in our own campaigning once our historians came across this use of the word, and that this particular man back in the 1920s had described it as such at that point. So I'll move on to the next one. So this is kind of the beginning of it, if you like. So this man is called Mike Hill, and at the time he was the bishop. We got two bishops in the Church of England. Got two bishops of Bristol, and Mike Hill was one of them. And this is actually what happened on this day. It was, from their perspective, it was normal. This is our annual ceremony. The students are coming in, and I'm going to read my sermon. But what also happened on this particular November, this year in November, in 2014, was a local journalist got into this ceremony. It's not a public ceremony. It's hundreds of school children. It's the merchants are in there. Their wives are in there. It's closed to the public, but this journalist got in and he recorded this bishop talking in his sermon to the children. And this man actually said to the children that he thinks that Edward Colston was a man of significance, and there's still this speculation about how he made his money. And as a Bristolian, once this was exposed, because he was a journalist, the local media basically picked up on it, and this bishop had to go on the BBC, local BBC radio station. He was kind of defending himself and saying he was misinterpreted, and kind of trying to defend what it was that he was actually saying. Now, whether Bishop Hill has any real historical understanding about who Edward Colston was was kind of irrelevant, really, because if he did, then he wouldn't be saying there's speculation, because there isn't speculation. But also he either didn't know, and he kind of, so he's repeating somebody else's line, and the line he's repeating is what the merchant venturers wanted the children, the school students in Bristol, to kind of get into their minds, really. And then when you give the children the bun at the end, they might not necessarily remember what the bishop said to them, or that he was talking about Jesus Christ in the same sentence as Edward Colston. He was comparing these two people. But what the children will remember is they get the bun, and that it's a kind of day out of school, and it's a bit different, and it's a bit, but the Bristol Cathedral, it dates back to the 12th century. It's a very significant historic building. And this person is very influential, not only in the Church of England, but also in Bristol. So as a teacher, I was looking at some of the schools that by now both Bristol Cathedral were running and the Society of Merchant Venturers. Both of these institutions have got into the academy system, and the society had brought a couple of their private schools from the private sector into the academy sector, but they'd also opened up a couple of other schools, and I was interested in who they were educating, because basically they were largely still educating the children that they'd always educated. It's just that the state was paying for their education now. So I had real issues with that, because Bristol has got massive wealth inequalities, and disadvantaged and vulnerable children are disadvantaged and made more vulnerable because of the structures that already exist. So I paid particular attention to this. And this happened in November. By Christmas, I had put an official complaint in I didn't realise at the time, but if you want to complain about a bishop, you do that to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who apparently is the boss, apparently. So this went up to Lancashire House in London with this complaint about basically this man telling falsehoods to children as part of their religious and educational practices. And in the meantime, I kind of started to talk to a couple of people that I'd sort of known along the way about the fact that not only the merchant venturers doing some dodgy stuff, the church is in cahoots with them as well. And so you've got arguably two of the most powerful institutions in Bristol reinforcing these myths and these half-truths to school children, and doing it on taxpayers' money. And so we started, so this is a selection really of the sorts of things that we did. So that was in 2014. So we knew it was going to be another year until they had these rituals and these ceremonies again. So we had quite a period of time to kind of discuss this, think about this. The historians went off and started doing their research. And in that meantime, the other thing that we sort of discovered was actually, look, there's a stained glass window. Now this stained glass window is in Bristol Cathedral, and this is Edward Colston. And he's up there with another of, there's probably about 10 or 11 sort of stained glass windows of males like this across the top of the cathedral. It's a huge building. So it's, so he's sort of, the cathedral had welcomed this particular figure into and memorialized him in their actual physical building. And then we've got, I think this is the North Tower. And this is, or the Colston Tower, as it also turns out, that the cathedral they call this tower. And this whole window here is dedicated to Edward Colston. And the window is, his kind of motto is "go and do likewise." So it's kind of a direct extraction from the Bible. Go and do likewise, go and do what Edward Colston did. Okay. So we kind of started to investigate and look at what was going on in the cathedral. At some point, there was some sort of, the roads were dug up and redirected and stuff across the centre of Bristol. And this blue thing was put around the plinth in order to protect it. And there was a group of people in Bristol who felt that that was an opportunity that couldn't be missed. So they, I don't know whether you can see it, that says, it's got, these are little hands pointing up to him. And it says kidnapper, it says human trafficker, it says murderer, that kind of thing. So they stuck all of these things around the bottom of this plinth, adding on various other pieces of sort of interventions that had gone on over many years. And this was literally the following year. So the following year, after the ceremony, we got into the cathedral, and these are the Colston buns that were obviously left over. So you can see the little starver thing on the top that each of the children get. And what we also discovered, that it wasn't only Bristol Cathedral that were having these ceremonies. So this is me a few years ago, and we're outside St Mary Redcliffe Church, which is another huge historic church in Bristol, where the Colston Society charity have their annual ceremony in November, and they have children from St Mary Redcliffe School, both the primary and the secondary school, go into St Mary Redcliffe, and they have a religious ceremony, and they talk about Edward Colston. And this is a play really on. This is me being a teacher, because apparently both of these schools are outstanding. That's what Ofsted tell us they are. And so that was very much my question to the people that were organising this sort of ceremony. And if you see in the background, you can see some cops. There were 2 of us there on that day, and there were 5 police officers. That was the level of fear. I mean, I don't know what they thought of us, I'm not really sure, but they knew that we were shaking the establishment. They knew that these big institutions, these historic hundreds and hundreds of year institutions, were very, very upset by what was going on. They really didn't like the fact that we were raising these questions, because ultimately the church has no answer to this. The church cannot defend these religious ceremonies that were happening, and they cannot defend some of the things that they were saying to the children. And I actually think that they just didn't ask the questions. They just continued with what had always gone on before. It's always happened. It's always happened. We've been having these ceremonies for hundreds of years. What's the big problem? And they just get their job. They become the dean of, or they become the bishop, and they just continue with whatever it was that went on before. And so it became really quite difficult for them to defend what they were doing, but also to answer some very pertinent questions. And you might, I hope I've got a little picture there of, I think that's City. Is that City or Sweep? But this was, it's quite interesting here, because an image of this window appeared on the front page of the Telegraph one morning. And it was the Dean of Bristol Cathedral saying, oh, well, if we're going to take this window down, it might cost us £50,000. And, you know, but we might think about it. Protesters have asked us to. Now, we'd never mentioned this window. Most of us didn't know it existed. But what we really felt was going on here was it was a kind of a last-ditch attempt by the establishment in Bristol to try and expose us as being some kind, you know, some kind of really sort of off the rail protesters, that we would demand this fantastic stained glass window be removed at the cost of tens of thousands of pounds, and nobody was asking for this window to be removed. And this was a little piece of social media that went out, and underneath it said, David the Dean takes out, you know, he takes a little break from his media distraction strategy, because what was happening by this time, the Guardian was the sort of left-wing mainstream press were discussing things, and they were very much trying to get hold of the narrative and to control the narrative. And it was really us saying, you're their puppet. You are their puppet, Mr. Dean, the Dean of Bristol Cathedral, because, and not only that, we see through it. And Countering Colston, us as a group, we just literally didn't respond to the article, to any of the journalists that rang us up. We were going, no, we've got no idea who these people are that are asking Bristol Cathedral to take this window down. Why don't you ask them? Because it's not us. So that kind of fell a bit flat on its face. And I really do think it was their last ditch attempt to try to kind of discredit us, if you like. And then we continue to make some noise, really. This is just some other examples. So this is us, really. It's myself and Ros. It's probably the third year, maybe. So I've got slave trader. I'm saying you don't have to wear his flower, because the kids would be given their flower. You don't have to wear it. He's a slave trader. And Ros is saying the violator of human rights, not a philanthropist. And this was a protest that took place outside St Stephen's Church, another huge church on the centre of Bristol, and it was the one that blessed the ships, because these churches are very historic. So this would have been on the river. I mean, it's all covered up down in Bristol now, but it would have been on the river, and they blessed their ships. So they were outside whilst there was one of these ceremonies going on inside, and afterwards the clergy came out and were talking to the protesters. They were very interested in what is it that you're saying? What is it that's going on? This is Ros doing chalking, which is something that she's done for many, many years. This is the other side of St Mary Redcliffe. And then if I move, I don't know if I need to move you. So this was kind of a Brucey bonus, really. So this was to do with the Colston Hall, that happened to have its 150th year, and so that just happened to coincide. And this is one of those pop-up banners that we created. So we've got our logo there. We've got that's from the tomb, and then we've got the transatlantic, that famous image of the transatlantic slave trade boat. And then we've got kind of, this would be the sort of image that the Colston Hall would use itself for its own promotion. And we went to the Colston Halls probably about 3 times when they were having these special events to celebrate 150 years. And we were playing a bit of music, we were doing a bit of talking outside, and we had this banner up. And people were interested. They were going into these special events in the Colston Hall. They were really quite interested in kind of, what we were doing, why we were there. And, it was, people kind of were kind of going, okay, yeah, fair enough. We get what you're saying here, because they're locals as well, a lot of them. So whilst we were going after religious and educational ceremonies and what charities were doing and actual current practice, in the meantime, other people were going after the statue itself, because the statue has been contested over many, many decades. This is not something that just gets left and people accept it. They don't accept this statue. So this is knitting. This is what they call a yarn bomb, I think. So that went up there at some point. And the more that we spoke about the Colston Hall or the Colston ceremonies, inevitably people started then to focus again on the statue. And I think that this is probably sort of what happened. And then this happened a lot. His face was whitewashed, white painted over. That happened a lot during the course and this is these are little human dummies. So this is the ship that was laid out, the markings of the ship put out in front of the plinth. A very, very powerful piece of artwork. And then this was an actual plaque that appeared one morning on the plinth. Now the sort of facts on here are not, this isn't a kind of isn't completely true, but the point is that it was becoming more intrusive because this was actually attached, and it kind of got to the point where the administration felt that they needed to do something to respond to it. And I kind of called it the plaque that never was, because this is a mock-up. So this is the bottom of the plinth. So this happened in 2018. The mayor announced there's going to be a kind of corrective plaque, they called it, and we're going to put it on the plinth. But what actually transpired is members of the merchant venturers got themselves involved, and the wording became so watered down that by the time the plaque was produced, the mayor refused to put it up because it pretty much said what it said originally. So much of it was taken out. They didn't like the truthful reality to be going on there, and they just argued and argued and argued, and the process was so poor. It was just, I mean, there was no democracy in it, there was no transparency in it. It was just a group of people that kind of had always done kind of artwork, if you like, and were in favour with the particular mayor. So despite the plaque being made, the mayor refused to sign it off for it to be put on. And he just left it at that. So all the time that we're having these protests, and here's a few more here. So here they are. This is what the merchants look like on an annual basis. They start at All Saints, which is where the tomb is, and then they march down to St Stephen's, looking like this. And what that one year they were met with protesters, and they don't like it. They really didn't like it. They're not used to it. And these are people that they're not politicians. They're not elected. They stay in the background. But they are very much the silent kind of establishment within the city. Colston Primary School starts to think about its own history. This is just an example of a local newspaper article that was kind of written up at the time, and I think this one is from The Guardian. So there were things happening, like there was quite a lot of noise that was going on around Colston and the ceremonies and the statue. And then we have what you could argue was kind of quite a good for Countering Colston, because by this time we'd started to just use Cult of Colston, not our words, this is somebody else's words from the 1920s, the R.J. Wilson. Toxic brand was not our words either. However, the brand itself was this kind of, it was like I describe it, it was being used like as a mascot for the Society of Merchant Venturers. So Colston, it was always, Colston was a philanthropist. That's how he was worded. That's what he was. Colston the philanthropist, as though that's a job or something. Colston himself had been a member of the Society of Merchant Venturers, and this kind of public relations was reinforced by the cathedral, the other churches, and also the council, to be honest, because there was never any challenge to it. And it had been going on for a very long time. So what the historians that were working with Countering Colston did was to go back and to do some actual research, which was, you know, and they popularized it. So it didn't stay in the academic kind of arena, which a lot of research can sort of stay amongst academics, and you know, there's a place for that. But we knew that if we were going to actually break through this kind of cult, that we needed to get to ordinary people in every part of the city, which is why we really wanted to have that kind of the local paper, basically, that was kind of having the printed paper, because there's a certain demographic across the city that we knew read that, and they needed to be equally as convinced as the younger population. And then social media was also an important tool that we used, and we built good relationships. There was a couple of journalists, local journalists, and they just really got it. They just really got what we were trying to do, and why we were not going for the statute, why we were going for the current educational and religious practices. And unfortunately, it was all a bit too hot for the Labour administration. As I said, the mayor had this plaque. He said, no, I don't like it. The words, you're just repeating what's already on there. But then nothing else continued from that. It was just stopped, and that was it. And then the more sort of community-based media outlets also felt that what Countering Colston was doing was also a little bit too hot, and the community-based media is they're very close with the Labour administration. So my perspective is that they became a bit politically influenced by what it was that the Bristol Labour mayor wanted, which basically was to kind of not really deal with any issues around Colston. So this breakthrough about this toxic brand. So these couple of demonstrations that we had outside the Colston Hall were successful, and the chief executive, Louise Mitcham, she made the announcement. She said that they were going to look at a change of name for the 150th year sort of birthday of the hall. And during that speech, she described Colston as a toxic brand. And we jumped on that in the way that we had jumped on Cult of Colston. We jumped on toxic brand, which was great for us because it wasn't our words. We were quoting somebody else who actually runs the Colston Hall. So, you know, it was quite useful for us to do that, and for her to say that. And really the Colston Hall was kind of the first domino in terms of leading towards, I suppose, what eventually happened, which was obviously on the day, the felling and the dumping of the statue. And I chose some of these images because I just wanted to kind of try to explain to you the political theatre that's going on here, and how widely popularised and how well known the history of Colston and of Bristol had become, and how it is that the young people in our city connected it with what was going on across the world. So obviously they pulled it down, and if you remember back to the image when it was the statue was falling off, it didn't have a blindfold on it. So somebody had gone on once it had fallen down and they put the blindfold on. And then when it's on the floor, they're graffitiing it and they're damaging it. But this image here was about the murder of George Floyd, which of course was the spark for the BLM movement during that summer in 2020. So the young people on this march, they could see that Colston and his involvement in being the architecture of the transatlantic slave trade was absolutely linked with the institutionalized racism that led to George Floyd's death in the US. But also by then, of course, the pandemic had exposed the existing inequalities within the structures that we knew about, and that was apparently becoming more popularized and more understood. But of course, there were many of us that already kind of would have known about these structural inequalities. And this site here is probably about 200 meters from this site, which is where the plinth is. So groups of young people collectively on the day made the decision that they weren't going to leave the statue by the plinth. They wanted it. They wanted that theatre to continue, and they decided that it was going to go in this part of the harbour. Now, this bridge here is called Perrot's Bridge, and Perrot was a known black servant for one of a big slave trading family in Bristol. It's now, their house is now a museum. It's just off Park Street, and it's a museum now. But this bridge was named after their Afro-Caribbean servant, or that they brought over from the Caribbean to who lived in their house. So he's one of the there's very few sort of Afro-Caribbean figures from this period that are known to have lived in Bristol, but this particular person was known and is documented historically. And so this bridge is named after that person. And these young people knew that this is also where the ships would have left at the time. So it was a deliberate, thought through act on their part to roll this statue and work out how they're going to move it, best part of 200 meters, and put it into the harbour, presumably because they weren't convinced that the council wouldn't try and put it back up if they didn't absolutely destroy it. I think there was a fear amongst them that the council might try and put it back up. And this is just a fabulous image. So this lady's called Jen Reid. So this was a statue that appeared a couple of weeks later. She calls this a surge of power. And I didn't know Jen Reid at the time, but I've met her a few times since. And she relays really eloquently how she felt to stand on that plinth, and the power the power she felt when she climbed up there and got onto this plinth. And then that statue was then kind of put back on there with Channel 4 filming it and stuff like this. And all of these placards were just left. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them left on the day. And a number of them were collected up and kind of saved and put into the museum alongside, obviously, the statue as well, because it eventually went into the M shed and went into a sort of local public consultation. I mean, this event on this day could have only have happened in Bristol with that statue on that day within the kind of local, national and global pandemic. It could, there was a zeitgeist that was just caught, our young people caught on that day, and they absolutely understood the symbolism of the statue, but also the symbolism of what they then collectively did as, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young people involved in it, despite the fact that the CPS felt that it was 4 people alone that had done it. it clearly was hundreds and hundreds of young people that had been educated, had educated themselves, had communicated with each other, and understood the significance of what they were doing on that day. And you know, I mean, I wasn't there when this happened, because it was a pandemic and I was kind of quite old and stuff, so it was kind of, you know, there was no vaccines, but it was an unbelievable day that the young people came together and did that. And so that's all I've got for that. I have got one other thing, if I can find it, I'd quite like to share. It's about oops. Because I was invited to talk about three things. One was the campaign itself, which hopefully you've got a good idea of, and the second thing was what happened after. And this, I can send you the link to the Bristol Radical History Group website, because this is where all the historic research is has been, and all the articles that they've written are stored. And this timeline was put together for the legal team, because you were quite involved. Some of us were quite involved with all the legal preparations for the trial when it came round. And so this is just a kind of a summary of the timeline. So in Bristol, literally the following day, we've got the private school saying that it's going to think about changing its name.
Sorry, Christine.
Yeah.
Christine, are you showing the timeline?
Oh yes, am I not?
No, we're not seeing it. We're still seeing the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can. Is that better?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, sorry. So this, as I said, this is I'll send you the links to this. So this is the timeline that was put together about all the things that kind of happened, if you like, immediately after. So there's a number of things that happened immediately after. We've got the statue is toppled, and then the schools immediately say, literally the next day, we're going to think about changing our name. And they took out these replica statues from their schools. And then 2 days later, we've got kind of all the local media sort of saying that this is, you know, it's the beginning. This is only the beginning. We've got a lot more things to do. And the cathedrals again saying, we're going to talk about that. We're going to think about that window. We're going to think about that window. And then within days, the Rees announces that it's going to have a history commission so that we can better understand our history. And then the Colston Tower, which was the picture that I showed you earlier that was built in the 70s, said it's also going to have a think about whether it wants to still call itself the Colston Tower. You got the Society of Merchant Venturers. So this was the organisation that absolutely created this cult, promoted this cult, all of that sort of thing. They then said we were wrong to get involved in the trying to water down that plaque that was supposed to go up in 2018. And when they issued this statement, I thought, yeah, I bet you were, because I actually think that was kind of the last straw, if you like, of inaction. And just people just went, if we don't take this down, it's never coming down. We need to get rid of this kind of this weight that hangs around Bristol's neck. So then within days, the Colston Hall starts taking its actual lettering down, and all the stained glass windows, they start covering them up, or they start putting little notes underneath explaining what they are in the churches across the city. The Colston Arms Public House, they say they're going to rename it. It's still out for discussion, but it looks like they might call it the Fallen Statue, which I just think is fantastic. And then we start seeing residents groups that live in road named after Colston in various parts of the city start going, hang on a minute, maybe we need to think about what this road was called before it was called Colston Road. So they've gone back, if you like, to the medieval street names and tried and suggested that they rename some of those. And then the Colston Society, the one that's not actually named after the man, they announced that they're going to disband. And then we've got the renaming. They say they're going to call it, Colston Hall says it's going to be called the Bristol Beacon. Then Colston Girls' School said it's going to change its name. And then these other two streets, Colston Street, Colston Avenue, they're going back to the original medieval street names. Dolphin Primary. So there's lots on here really. So I'll send you the link to this so you can look at this a bit more. But then we've got stuff that happened in the United Kingdom, so Wales, Oxford, London, Edinburgh, all over the country. Things start to kind of, people are stirred to want to do things. There's lots there. And then the international stuff. So there's quite a lot in the USA. But probably, or arguably, one of the most poignant things was, I'll stop sharing now. One of the most poignant things from our perspective was that there was a reference at the George Floyd funeral to the events in Bristol, where the preacher said, we've got grandchildren of slave masters tearing down statues of slave masters and throwing them in the river, because he was speaking about the unity that had happened in the movement across the world. And that was also seen in Bristol, with the multiracial kind of rejection of kind of institutionalized racism, but also of these institutions that perpetuate it. And in Bristol, it's very much the certain elements of the Church of England, with the cathedral and big churches, and this Society of Merchant Venturers. And I'll stop there. I don't know if anybody wants to.
Well, Christine, thanks ever so much. It's been an incredibly compelling and very heartwarming story. So there's an awful lot more to it than we'd been kind of just getting the superficial side of the story. No, it's absolutely wonderful. Well done. Amazing. So we'll have time for questions. Is that all right, Christine?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to just start briefly. Bishop Mike Hill, is he still around? And he said things that kind of refute what he previously said?
He isn't still around. He kind of quietly was no longer the Bishop of Bristol. So kind of the next time you look, he's a bishop somewhere else, which I thought was quite interesting. But what has happened with Bishop Hill is that he took early retirement. I think you might describe it as early retirement, because he was found to have been he was found to have racially stereotyped other members of the clergy when he was basically interviewing them for promotion. So a complaint was made by another member of the clergy, and so I think that they quietly retired him somewhere.
Right. So this was entirely in parallel to what he'd said about Colston, but it was part of the story, really. Yeah. How interesting. Yeah. So Jenny, can I pick on you? You had something to do with the school. You need to go on mute. You take yourself off mute, Jenny. Bottom left of your screen, Jenny, you'll find your unmute. Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
When you say Jenny, you mean me, do you?
Yes, yeah, I mean you.
Actually, the question I wanted to ask Christine was, I remember you saying that all this razzmatazz about Colston happened, was it as much of a century or more after his actual death? And you drew a parallel between what was happening in the Victorian times when the statue and all the rest was put up, those conditions there, and the fact that they suddenly decided to, well, that's the impression I got, suddenly decided to have a go at more immortalising Colston? You know, you've got the parallel between the. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? And if you could.
Yeah, I think so. The statue went up in 1895.
So it was a long while after he died. So why did they suddenly come up with trying to?
Colston. So throughout the Victorian period, there was this growing sense that Colston was this very important man in the city. The kind of left-wing historians would argue that the Victorian period saw this it was this deserving, undeserving poor, this patronage, and it was very much about kind of people made their money and they were good people if they then gave to good causes, if you like. And the Colston was seen by this particular group of people who were very, very powerful as being the archetype of that, because he'd been doing it when he was alive back in the 17th century. He had left some money, he had opened a school, he had built some almshouses. So there was this sort of character that was a member of their organisation who had done these things. So the Victorian period saw this kind of growing sense of Colston throughout the years, and then the statue went up at the end of the 19th century, and it was a period of a lot of unrest. There was a lot of unrest across the country, but there was a lot of unrest in Bristol particularly, and Colston was the kind of the Tory figure. And then the other statue that's down there is Edmund Burke, who was the kind of Whig figure. So we had this sort of liberal Tory sort of political thing going on, and they wanted to sort of bring the city together in terms of the ruling elites, because they were also sort of there was some issues between the ruling elites, and if they felt if they could bring the ruling elites together, then the sort of the workers would be sort of better looked after, but also they'd stop rioting, because there was quite a lot, and striking. There was a lot of strikes as well in the city. So I suppose the statue was a kind of pinnacle, I suppose, of this kind of memorialization of Colston. But certainly the stained glass windows were added during that Victorian period in the churches in the city. Does that answer your question?
Do raise your hand, either using the little icon below or just put your hand up. Karen, and then Phil.
You've had amazing success in a very short time with your campaign. And obviously, you know, the ripples go far and wide, and, you know, it's been amazing. Most of us campaign for years and years, knowing that, you know, if we're honest, we'll never get to our goal. But do you feel you've achieved your goal? Will you carry on in a different sort of guise, or what will you do now?
I mean, what I'd say certainly about the statue and not this cult of Colston, that was something that we did discover, but certainly the statue, you know, that has been contested for many, many decades. It's, you know, we knew we were building on and accelerating what had gone before us. There have been many, many protests around that statue, but equally, that was one of the reasons why we didn't go after the statue, because that had always it had always come to nothing and largely ignored, because actually most people ignore statues, but it's much more difficult to ignore educational practice and religious practices, and actually what the words that are coming out of sort of, you know, bishops and deans and head teachers and things like that. It's much more difficult to ignore that. I mean, the backlash has been very big. My passion is around equity and education. We still haven't got that in the city. It's still, you know, certain schools that this Merchant Venturers and the Cathedral run, their academies are still very selective, not deliberately, they would say, and they would argue whether, but you know, the social selection is because there are barriers in the way of how they choose to allocate their places to their schools. So whilst the statue going in the river was fantastic, that was never the aim if you like. That was just something that kind of happened because everything came together on that particular day that was local, national and international. And I don't think we realised at the time how well the history had been publicised and how a page had been turned with how people viewed this particular legacy in our city. So no, it's never over, I suppose, is it? You take the baton from those that came before you and you pass it on to those that come after you, and progress is not linear. It kind of goes backwards and forwards, and actually I would suggest that at the moment, possibly arguably, we've got, as a globally but also sort of nationally, we've gone back a bit with Brexit and stuff like that. So, and all of these things are quite linked, sort of in the big kind of philosophical sense. And the statue went in the river before I was elected as a councillor, and I was elected as a councillor to, bring on the green agenda, bring on social justice. So really, we're only just starting. I think certainly the statue going in the river, it just shocked people. It was an absolute smack in the face for Bristolians, but others around, the country and the world, arguably. And certainly the establishment went, oh, okay, wow. There's a lot of really upset young people that are giving us a massive message. And Bristol's got a history of really quite radical protests and movements. And the establishment have a very long memory, because they're in the positions they're in, because their predecessors have always managed to maintain the political power and the wealth. And that's, and I would consider myself I take on the baton of those that came before us with their activism, and we will pass that on. But those that are members of the establishment and hold those power strings, they're doing the same. So what's passed on to them is Bristol's a really rioty city, and people do, that things spark up, and suddenly there's a massive issue going on in the city, and that the nobody really saw it coming kind of events. Those have happened over the years, over the centuries in Bristol.
Phil, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Christine, for your talk. I was intrigued, and still am, as to the inactivity of the police on the day. Can we have your comments on that, please? Although you weren't there in person, there must have been some thinking of why they were so inactive.
Yeah, they got a lot of criticism, didn't they, from certain quarters, the police. Well, the police were fully aware of the controversies that surrounded that statue. They knew. The police read the papers, the police follow social media, they can see what's going on, they knew what was happening, and their strategy on the day was to deliberately be low key, because there had been a number of violence with some BLM marches up in London, and they deliberately stepped back, and it was very much community sort of policing. They were on push bikes. There wasn't a riot van in sight. Maybe they were somewhere, but certainly there were none on the centre or surrounding the protesters. Unlike a few months later, when they came in and they were smashing people's faces in riot gears, stuff like that. It completely changed. But on that day, that particular approach was very community led. And the sergeant, when he was interviewed, he said, I'm not going to send my police to defend a statue of a slave trader. And they knew that they were completely outnumbered. The number of people that were surrounding that statue, you would have to have had thousands of police officers to prevent what eventually happened. And he did get a lot of criticism, but having said that, he's since been kind of honoured, if you like, some kind of police honour, acknowledgement of his community engagement. I think the police on that day was absolutely fantastic. There was no arrests. They didn't arrest anyone. Literally nothing, not one window was smashed on that day. Nothing was graffitied. There was nobody went to hospital, nothing. There was literally, what happened was what we saw on that on the videos that kind of went viral, and that was it. And I know that there are those that say that's criminal damage, it's vandalism, whatever it is that they want to call it, even though that the 4 people that went to court were found not guilty, and no crime was committed on that day by 4 people that ended up in court. And they did get a lot of criticism, I know, and they were talking about it in Parliament, and Priti Patel was calling people the mob and things like this. And it did have an impact a few months later when there were protests against the Cllr bill, and the police really did come in very heavy-handed. Yeah, so they kind of went from one extreme to the other, but nobody was in hospital that day, unlike the following sort of protests around the Cllr bill that happened in Bristol.
Any other questions? Hands up. Dave, go ahead.
Thank you, Christine, for a fascinating talk. I really got a lot out of that. That was brilliant. The little thing that most impressed me was in your timeline at the end about the total capitulation of the merchant venturers, who ended up saying, yes, it was the right thing to take the statue down. I still don't really understand who they are. Are they a bit like a Masonic lodge, or I can't think of any other equivalent anywhere else? Yeah,
I think that would probably be, it's like our very own local version of the Masons. Yes. So they were traders back in the Middle Ages, and this institution has just remained. Liverpool had them, but they got rid of it in the sort of the 1960s and the 1970s. Whereas in Bristol, they've just kind of stayed and remained. But the individuals, it's a private members club. So you're kind of patted on the shoulder and invited in, if you like. They've got a massive mansion, must be worth millions and millions of pounds, up in one of the most expensive parts of Bristol, up in Clifton. And over the years, clearly this organisation has been left probably lots of money, lots of trust, lots of land, but they have a royal charter, which means that only those who are members of the Privy Council can see their accounts. And this is part of what we're still continuing to want to kind of expose, really, and fight with the merchant venturers. Is we want to know how much what do you own, what are you investing in, and where did your money come from? Because those are the 3 kind of the big questions, because they portray themselves as civic sort of people involved in civic life, and they're involved in charities, and they do this great work, and they run these trusts that are involved in almshouses and adult social care, and they run some schools and some youth work, things like that. But what they don't show you is what land they own, how they got hold of that land, what they invest in, those sorts of things. It's very, very opaque as an organisation. I mean, it's about 90 people that are currently members, and they've got about 6 women. They've got 1 black woman that joined in 2020. Yeah, it's an old, I mean, the sort of, and they've just been around for hundreds of years. It's these kind of old guilds, these kind of guilds things. It's very, because Bristol is such a historic city, and it was the kind of London, it was the port, it was, the sort of cash cow for, a number of decades, quite early on in that international sort of transatlantic trading triangle. Bristol was the city, but has always been very, very important, and it's the centre of the southwest in terms of where the kind of control was for the rest of the southwest, and then going out into Wales. So it's always been an important city in that sense. But yeah, the merchant venturers are a very strange group of people, and they're involved in everything. They set up these charities, and I mean everything. I mean people that manage senior management in the NHS trusts that provide our health care in the city, and out a bit further, everything they sit on the sort of third sector charitable trust funds. So they're involved in lots and lots of civic things, but they also have got the chair of Wessex Water, for example, is a member, and a couple of the members of the Merchant Venturers are also lay canons for Bristol Cathedral. So they are literally, so that's like the governing that sit on the chapter, and they're the governing body of Bristol Cathedral. So they're literally the same people that are running the cathedral and members of the Merchant Venturers. So it's a very odd organisation that won't show us their books, but at some point we will make sure that they do. Otherwise, they can get out of our democracy, basically.
Christine, there must be dozens, if not hundreds, of descendants of Colston. Are there any that have stuck their head above the parapet on either side of the argument?
Well, he didn't ever get married. So, but there are people with the surname Colston in America. So I have seen a couple of interviews with people who kind of, until the statue and all the hoo-ha with the statue, until that point, they had no idea what their surname meant. And some of them were white, and some of them were Afro-Caribbean, some of them were of mixed heritage, but they were kind of, and that was, they had no idea that they were associated with this kind of relatively small city in the southwest of Britain, with Americans. But yeah, Colston is a relatively common surname, not necessarily in Bristol, but certainly in America and the Caribbean. Yeah, it is a surname that is relatively common.
Jenny.
If I could ask another question, Christine, I think you're interested in going back to your interest in education. Could you say something about the racism and the British Empire and the school curriculum, how the school curriculum addresses or does not address the problems of the British Empire and the repercussions of Britain having an so-called empire?
Yeah, I think a few decades ago, children were taught that the British Empire was a great thing, and it was spoken. The word British Empire was used. More recently, we will talk of the curriculum talks about this particular event in history. So, Cabot, for example, discovering America. But what they won't talk about is what the motivations for that were, because we know it was about wealth, what resources could be found, those sorts of things, what can be claimed for Elizabeth I, what could be claimed for Britain, compared to what the Portuguese or what the Spanish or which are, other European countries that were also interested in this kind of exploration. So it's not, I don't think it's framed particularly well, and it's very much taught still largely from the Western perspective. So if you're teaching African history, it's as though it starts with the slave trade and nothing happened before then. And there are great civilizations in Africa and African history that go back obviously millennia, but it's not necessarily taught, other than the Egyptian civilization. And if you spoke to children and asked them where they think Egypt is, most of them would think it wasn't in Africa, because it's kind of taught slightly separately, as though it's not a great African civilization, which I find quite odd. And that's reinforced with how the media and documentaries and how other things are portrayed. And it's also the other thing about the British Empire, to put light on a minute, is as if it's there was just passive resistance. Everybody just accepted that the British were going to come over and kind of, you know, colonize our lands, and that the working classes in Britain just accepted that this was the ruling class and this was what was going to happen. So there's very little about any resistance. There's very little about collective activity and organization amongst the working classes, other than really big things like the Peasants' Revolt, for example, after the Second Plague, or the Jarrow Marches. Really big events like that. And it's almost as if it just kind of happened. Nothing was going on before. Everybody was really annoyed for a couple of months, and they all just did something that kind of changed history. And of course, we know that that's not how things happen, and that these are generally building up over many years, and you need organisers in order to bring people together for these kind of very big events. And the other thing about how the empire is taught, it's kind of as if the British invented slavery so that they could then abolish it. So it's Wilberforce that's Wilberforce is the abolitionist, when actually the abolitionists were the Africans themselves on the ships that were resisting kind of the whole time. Haiti, there was a huge revolution there. So that resistance, that organized resistance, is very undertaught in my view, because it was very much people kind of organizing and going against the norms, and going against those in the established kind of positions of power, that brought about the end of these really exploitative systems. And you would never know that the Industrial Revolution in Britain largely was financed by those that had the compensation from the end of the transatlantic slave trade. That's not necessarily something that's really widely known, and it's certainly not when I've taught history over the years, certainly not in any of the textbooks. You don't talk about who it is that own the coal mines, and where did the families that own the coal mines, where did they get their money from? Well, largely, historically, it was a large amount of that was the compensation. Great Western Railway that goes from Bristol to London, largely the private finance came from the compensation that was paid at the end of the abolition of the slave trade. So those connections are really not very well taught. And I think it's kind of, we do our children a real disservice for them to not see that timeline.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Well, John, we have just about run out of time, unless it's a very short question. Take yourself off mute. John?
I just hope that these ripples that you so ably described to us will reverberate across. And we had a very powerful presentation recently on loss and damage to these communities who were, as it were, the receiving end of the slave trade, based on the experience of Jamaica. So let's hope your efforts will bear fruit in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And on that point, Christine, thanks ever so much for an absolutely fascinating talk. We really appreciated it. And as I said, we will also be making the recording available on the website as usual. So usually there's another 20 people or so who watch the recording afterwards. So thanks again, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I will send you through the link certainly to the Radical History Group, because that's where that timeline is. There's some fantastic articles in there, and you can see the historical research that they did that really helped to educate people.
Thanks. Good. Everyone, thanks very much for attending, and we'll close the meeting.
And
Thank
see
you.
you on
Bye.
Monday.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Right. Close. Leave.
Bye, bye, Ian.
Grissom, yes.
Bye. Okay, I'll
Yeah.
close it for everyone now. Bye.
Bye.
See you Monday.
Yeah. Okay.